The silver pocket watch landed on the dust-caked planks of Garrison's general store with a dull thud. Its delicate chain still clutched in Olivia Hayes' trembling fingers. Her heart stopped as Elias Garrison's accusing finger shot toward her face, his voice booming across the crowded store on that sweltering July afternoon in 1878. "Thief! This woman stole from me." The words crashed through the frontier town of Scottsbluff, Nebraska, like thunder, and Olivia knew in that terrible moment her life would never be the same. "I did no such thing," Olivia protested, her voice barely audible above the sudden murmurs that rippled through the store. The 24-year-old schoolteacher's cheeks burned with humiliation as curious customers turned to stare. "Mr. Garrison, please, there's been a misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding, Miss Hayes," Garrison sneered, his prosperous belly straining against an embroidered vest as he stepped around the counter. At 48, the merchant had built his business into the most profitable establishment in the county, and his word carried weight. "I've been missing inventory for weeks. Now I catch you red-handed with my merchandise." "That watch belongs to my father," Olivia insisted, panic rising in her throat. She had only brought it in hoping to trade it for supplies. The school term had ended, her salary wouldn't resume until fall, and her pantry was nearly bare. "It's a family heirloom." Garrison's thin lips twisted in a cruel smile. "A convenient story, Sheriff Peters." He called to the man who had just entered the store. "I want this woman arrested." Sheriff Peters, a weathered man with tired eyes, looked uncomfortable but nodded. "Miss Hayes, I'm afraid you'll need to come with me." "This is absurd," Olivia said, tears threatening to spill. "I've taught half the children in this town. I'm no thief." As the sheriff took her arm, the store's door swung open, admitting a tall figure whose presence seemed to fill the space. Matthew Zachary removed his hat, revealing sun-bleached brown hair and eyes the color of worn leather. At 31, the cowboy had spent the last decade working cattle drives across the frontier before recently settling on a small ranch outside Scottsbluff. "What's happening here?" His deep voice cut through the commotion, carrying the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being heard. "Town business, Zachary," Garrison snapped. "This woman's been caught stealing." Matthew's gaze settled on Olivia's tear-streaked face, recognition flickering in his eyes. They had exchanged pleasantries on the few occasions their paths had crossed, most recently when he donated lumber to repair the schoolhouse roof. "Miss Hayes is the schoolteacher," Matthew said, his tone measured. "Doesn't seem the thieving type." "Appearances deceive," Garrison replied coldly. "I've lost over $50 in merchandise this month alone. Found her trying to sell me back my own pocket watch." Matthew's eyes narrowed as he studied the watch on the counter. "May I?" Without waiting for permission, he picked it up, turning it over in his calloused hands. "This is a Hamilton. Quality piece." He opened the case, examining the inscription inside. "To George Hayes, with honor and gratitude, 1863. Olivia felt a surge of hope. "My father received it after serving in the war. Please, Mr. Zachary." "Convenient inscription," Garrison interjected. "Could have been done any time." "Sheriff," Matthew said calmly, "I'd like to post Miss Hayes bail if you're indeed taking her in." Sheriff Peters looked relieved at the potential resolution. "That would be $50, Matthew." $50, Olivia gasped. "That's 2 months' salary." Matthew reached into his pocket and counted out the money without hesitation. "Consider it done." "This doesn't prove her innocence," Garrison protested, his face reddening. "The law must take its course." "And it will," Matthew assured him, his voice hardening slightly. "But Miss Hayes deserves a fair hearing, not a spectacle in your store." Sheriff Peters pocketed the money. "She'll need to appear before Judge Wilson next week. Until then, she's free to go." "This is outrageous," Garrison spluttered. "She could run." "Miss Hayes isn't going anywhere," Matthew stated with certainty, holding the merchant's gaze until the older man looked away. "Are you Miss Hayes?" "No," Olivia said firmly, finding her voice again. "I have nothing to hide and nowhere to run. This is my home." As they stepped out into the harsh sunlight, Olivia felt the weight of stares from townspeople gathered on the boardwalk. News traveled fast in Scottsbluff. By sunset, everyone would know of her disgrace. "Thank you for your intervention, Mr. Zachary," she said stiffly once they were away from the crowd. "I'll repay your money as soon as I can." "No rush," he replied, guiding her away from curious eyes. "And it's Matthew. Mr. Zachary was my father. Why would you help me? You barely know me." Matthew paused, considering his words. "Let's just say I know what it's like to be judged unfairly, and something about Garrison's accusation doesn't sit right." "He's lying," Olivia said, her voice breaking. "But who will believe me over him?" "He's Elias Garrison, and I'm just the woman who's educated half the children in this county," Matthew finished. "That counts for something, Miss Hayes." "Olivia," she corrected automatically. "And apparently it counts for very little when weighed against a merchant's word." They had reached the small cottage at the edge of town, where Olivia had lived alone since her father's passing the previous winter. The modest home stood in stark contrast to the Garrison mansion on the hill overlooking the town. "I'll walk you home," Matthew offered, but Olivia shook her head. "You've done enough. I don't want to cause you trouble. Elias Garrison has influence in this town." "So do good people," Matthew countered, "and I've never much cared for influence anyway." He tipped his hat. "I'll come by tomorrow." "There's more to this story than Garrison's letting on, and I aim to find out what." "Why would you do that for me?" Matthew's expression softened. "Because in my experience, Miss Hayes, school teachers rarely become thieves overnight, and merchants rarely make accusations without something to gain." As he walked away, Olivia stood at her gate, watching his retreating figure. For the first time since Sheriff Peters had led her from the store, she felt something besides fear and shame. She felt a glimmer of hope. Inside her cottage, Olivia sank into her father's old chair and finally allowed herself to cry. The tears came in heaving sobs that racked her slender frame. Her reputation, carefully built over 3 years of teaching in Scottsbluff, now lay in tatters. Even if she proved her innocence, the whispers would follow her. She thought of her students and their parents. Would they believe her? Or would they see only what Garrison wanted them to see? A desperate woman driven to theft. As twilight descended, a gentle knock at her door startled her. She hastily wiped her eyes and smoothed her skirt before opening it to find Clara Wilson, the doctor's wife and one of the few women in town Olivia considered a friend. "I heard what happened," Clara said simply, stepping inside with a covered basket. "I brought supper." "Thought you might not feel up to cooking." The simple kindness brought fresh tears to Olivia's eyes. "Thank you." Clara set the basket on the table and turned to embrace her. "Now tell me everything, and don't leave anything out." Olivia recounted the afternoon's events, her voice steadying as she spoke. Clara listened without interruption, her kind face betraying nothing but concern. "Elias Garrison has been acting strangely these past months," Clara observed when Olivia finished. "Edward says he's been drinking more heavily since his wife left for her sisters in St. Louis." "Mrs. Garrison left." This was news to Olivia. Clara nodded. 2 months ago. The official story is that her sister is ill, but there have been rumors." She trailed off. "Not that it excuses what he's done to you." "You believe me?" Olivia asked quietly. "Of course I do," Clara replied without hesitation. "And so will others. Matthew Zachary standing up for you counts for something. He's not one to involve himself in town affairs without reason. I barely know him. He's a good man, Clara said. Keeps to himself but fair. Brought his sister to live with him after her husband died in that mining accident up in Dakota Territory. Raises horses now, does well enough. She paused. I should tell you, though there's already talk. Olivia's stomach tightened. What kind of talk? The kind that follows when a single man defends a single woman. People will assume. That's ridiculous, Olivia protested, heat rising to her cheeks. He was simply being decent. Clara patted her hand. Decency is rare enough these days that people look for ulterior motives. She rose to leave. Eat something. Get some rest. Things will seem clearer in the morning. After Clara left, Olivia picked at the stew her friend had brought but found she had little appetite. The events of the day kept replaying in her mind. Why had Garrison chosen her? What possible motive could he have? And why had Matthew Zachary, a man she barely knew, risked his reputation and $50 to help her? Sleep came fitfully that night, haunted by dreams of accusing voices and the clang of jail cell doors. Morning dawned clear and hot, promising another scorching July day. Olivia had just finished dressing when a knock sounded at her door. She opened it to find Matthew on her porch, hat in hand. Hope I'm not calling too early, Miss Hayes. No, I've been up, she said, suddenly conscious of her simple dress and hastily pinned hair. Would you like to come in? I can offer coffee. That would be welcome, he said, following her inside. He looked too large for her small parlor, his broad shoulders and height making the room seem even smaller. Olivia busied herself with the coffee pot, grateful for something to do with her hands. I want to thank you again for yesterday. It was a kindness I won't forget. No need for thanks, Matthew replied, settling carefully onto a chair that seemed too delicate for his frame. I've been asking around town. Seems Garrison's been making accusations against others too, mostly folks passing through who can't defend themselves. Olivia turned to face him, coffee forgotten. What? Why? That's what we need to find out. But first, he reached into his pocket and withdrew her father's pocket watch. I thought you might want this back. Olivia gasped, reaching for it with trembling fingers. How did you? Let's just say Garrison wasn't guarding it very carefully, Matthew said with a slight smile. Don't worry, I left him a note saying I'd borrowed it for evidence. That was dangerous, Olivia said, clutching the watch. He could have you arrested. He could try, Matthew acknowledged with a shrug. But I know Sheriff Peters well enough. He's not convinced of your guilt either. What evidence do you hope to find with this? Olivia asked, running her thumb over the familiar engraving. I want to prove it belonged to your father, Matthew explained. Do you have any documentation? Letters mentioning it, perhaps? Olivia's face brightened. Yes, father kept a journal during the war. He mentioned receiving the watch after Gettysburg. She hurried to a small secretary desk and pulled out a worn leather-bound book. It's all here, Matthew nodded. That's a start, but we need more. We need to understand why Garrison is doing this. Clara, Mrs. Wilson mentioned that Mrs. Garrison has been away. Could that have something to do with it? Possibly, Matthew said, accepting the cup of coffee she finally remembered to offer. I think we should pay a visit to Lydia Turner. The seamstress. Why? She works for the Garrisons. If anyone knows what's happening in that house, it would be her. Olivia hesitated. I'm not sure I should show my face in town just yet. The things people must be saying. All the more reason to be seen, Matthew countered. Hiding makes you look guilty. Head high, Olivia. You've done nothing wrong. The use of her given name startled her, but she found she didn't mind. There was something comforting about the way he said it, like a promise that everything would be all right. Very well, she agreed. Let me get my shawl. They walked into town together, ignoring the stares and whispers that followed them down Main Street. Olivia felt her resolve strengthening with each step. Matthew's solid presence beside her was oddly reassuring. Lydia Turner's shop was tucked between the barber shop and the telegraph office. The bell above the door jangled as they entered, and the small, bird-like woman looked up from her sewing. "Miss Hayes, Mr. Zachary," she greeted them, her expression careful. "What can I do for you today?" "We were hoping for a word in private, Miss Turner," Matthew said. Lydia glanced around the empty shop. "I suppose now's as good a time as any. Come through to the back." In the cluttered workroom behind the shop, Lydia gestured for them to sit. "I heard what happened yesterday," she said to Olivia. "A terrible business." "Miss Turner," Matthew began, "we believe Mr. Garrison has been making false accusations, not just against Miss Hayes but others as well." Lydia's hands twisted in her apron. "I shouldn't say anything. He's an important customer. Please," Olivia urged. "My reputation, my livelihood, everything is at stake." The seamstress sighed deeply. "Things haven't been right at the Garrison house for some time. Mrs. Garrison didn't go to her sister's because of illness. She left because she discovered Mr. Garrison has been embezzling from the business." "Embezzling," Matthew repeated. "How?" "He's been gambling," Lydia explained in a low voice. "Cards mostly. Lost a fortune in Omaha last spring. He's been taking money from the store to cover his debts, then claiming theft to explain the shortages to his wife and the bank." "And Mrs. Garrison found out," Olivia said, beginning to understand. "She confronted him, threatened to divorce him if he didn't stop. He promised he would, but then she found more evidence. She left 2 months ago. Since then, he's been drinking heavily and the thefts have continued. But he needs someone to blame." "Why me?" Olivia asked. "Of all people in town." Lydia looked uncomfortable. "The school board meeting last month. You spoke against his proposal to cut funding for books. He hasn't forgotten that humiliation." The pieces were falling into place. "Garrison's accusation wasn't random, it was revenge. Would you be willing to testify to this?" Matthew asked. "If it came to that," fear flashed across Lydia's face. "I can't, he'd ruin me. Half my business comes from his store." "We understand," Olivia assured her, though disappointment churned in her stomach. "Thank you for telling us what you know." Outside the shop, Olivia turned to Matthew. "Now what? Without testimony, it's still my word against his." "We need more evidence," Matthew said thoughtfully. "And I think I know where to find it." They spent the next 3 days building their case. Matthew spoke with merchants in neighboring towns who had done business with Garrison, uncovering discrepancies in his accounts. Olivia, meanwhile, discovered that 3 travelers had been accused of theft in the past month alone. All had paid Garrison directly to avoid jail, and all had promptly left town. On the 4th day, Matthew rode to Omaha and returned with a gambling hall proprietor named Jenkins, who confirmed that Garrison had lost over $500 in his establishment and had written bad checks to cover the losses. "Why would you help us?" Olivia asked Jenkins as they sat in Sheriff Peter's office, Matthew having convinced the lawman to hear them out. "Because Garrison threatened to expose my establishment to the authorities if I came collecting," Jenkins explained. "I run a fair business, but not all officials see it that way. Besides," he added with a wink at Matthew, "I owe this man a favor from way back." Sheriff Peters listened to their evidence with growing concern. "This is serious," he acknowledged when they finished. "Fraud, false accusations. If this is true, Garrison could face prison." "It's true," Matthew insisted. "And there's more. I believe he's been doctoring his ledgers. If you were to compare them with the bank's records, I'd need a warrant for that," the sheriff interrupted. "And Judge Wilson is friendly with Garrison." "Then we'll present our case at the hearing," Olivia said firmly. "In public where it can't be ignored." Sheriff Peters looked doubtful. "It's risky. Garrison won't go down without a fight." "Neither will we," Matthew stated, his hand finding Olivia's in a gesture of support that felt both surprising and natural. The sheriff noticed the gesture and something in his expression softened. "All right. The hearing is set for tomorrow morning. Bring everything you have, and I mean everything." As they left the sheriff's office, Olivia was acutely aware that Matthew hadn't released her hand. She didn't pull away. "Are you ready for tomorrow?" he asked as they walked toward her cottage. "As ready as I'll ever be," she replied. "Thank you for everything you've done. I don't know why you've gone to such lengths for me." Matthew was quiet for a moment, his stride slowing. "When I first came to Scottsbluff, most folks viewed me with suspicion, a stranger keeping to himself, not sharing his past. But you—" He smiled down at her. "You invited me to speak to your students about the cattle drives, treated me like I belonged." "I remember," Olivia said softly. "The children talked about your stories for weeks." "Small kindnesses matter," Matthew said. "They're remembered." They had reached her gate, and Olivia felt a curious reluctance to end their conversation. "Would you like to come in for supper? It's the least I can offer after all you've done." Matthew's face lit with a smile that transformed his weathered features. "I'd like that very much." The meal was simple cornbread and a stew Olivia had prepared that morning, but the conversation flowed easily. Matthew spoke of his years on the cattle drives, of the sister who now lived with him, of his dreams for his small ranch. Olivia found herself sharing her own hopes, expanding the school, perhaps one day opening a proper library for the town. "You love it here," Matthew observed. "Despite everything." "I do," Olivia admitted. "Scottsbluff has become home. That's why this accusation hurts so deeply. These are my neighbors, my students' parents. For them to think I could—" "They'll know the truth soon," Matthew assured her. "And those who matter most already believe in you." As he prepared to leave, standing in her doorway with his hat in his hands, Matthew hesitated. "Whatever happens tomorrow, Olivia, I want you to know I'm glad our paths crossed." "So am I," she replied, surprised by the depth of feeling behind her words. He reached out, his calloused fingers gently brushing a strand of hair from her face. The touch lasted only a moment, but Olivia felt it like a brand upon her skin. "Until tomorrow," Matthew said, his voice low, and then he was gone, striding down the path toward town where he'd left his horse. Olivia closed the door and leaned against it, her heart racing with emotions she hadn't expected. In less than a week, Matthew Zachary had gone from a casual acquaintance to— what exactly? A champion, a friend. Something more. Tomorrow would bring its own answers, she decided. For now, she needed to prepare for the fight ahead. The town hall was packed the next morning. Judge Wilson, a stern man with graying side whiskers, presided from a makeshift bench at the front of the room. Elias Garrison sat with his lawyer, looking confident and occasionally nodding to supporters in the crowd. Olivia felt a flutter of panic as she took her place at the defendant's table. Matthew sat beside her, his solid presence calming her nerves. They had no lawyer, none in town would take her case against Garrison, but Matthew had assured her they had truth on their side. "This hearing will come to order," Judge Wilson announced, bringing down his gavel. "We are here to determine if Miss Olivia Hayes should stand trial for the theft of property from Garrison's general store. Mr. Garrison, please present your case." Garrison's lawyer, a slick man named Harmon, laid out the accusation. Olivia had been caught with a valuable pocket watch stolen from the store. Furthermore, inventory records showed numerous items missing over the past months, coinciding with Olivia's visits to the establishment. "And where is this pocket watch now?" Judge Wilson asked. A murmur went through the crowd as Garrison and his lawyer exchanged glances. It appears to have been misplaced since the incident, Your Honor, Harmon admitted reluctantly. Convenient, Matthew muttered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. Mr. Zachary, the judge warned, you will have your turn to speak. When Garrison's lawyer finished, Matthew stood. Your Honor, Miss Hayes is innocent of all charges. The pocket watch in question was a family heirloom belonging to her late father, George Hayes. He presented the journal entries Olivia had found, as well as letters from her father mentioning the watch. Furthermore, Matthew continued, we have evidence that Mr. Garrison has been falsely accusing travelers of theft to cover shortages in his inventory shortages caused by his own embezzlement to cover gambling debts. Gasps erupted throughout the room. Garrison leapt to his feet. This is slander. I demand these wild accusations be stricken from the record. They are not wild accusations, Matthew replied calmly. We have witnesses. One by one, their witnesses came forward. Jenkins described Garrison's gambling losses. A bank clerk, persuaded by Sheriff Peters to examine the records, testified to discrepancies in the store's accounts. 2 merchants from neighboring towns spoke of Garrison's increasingly erratic business dealings. Throughout the testimony, Olivia watched Garrison's face. The confident smirk gradually gave way to a sickly pallor. By the time Matthew called their final witness, Mrs. Garrison herself, who had returned from St. Louis at Matthew's telegraphed request, the merchant looked utterly defeated. Mrs. Garrison's testimony was devastating. She described finding evidence of her husband's gambling, the missing funds, his promises to reform followed by more lies. When I confronted him about the latest shortages before I left, she concluded, he told me he would find someone to blame. I never thought he would target Miss Hayes, a woman who has done so much for this community. Judge Wilson's face had grown increasingly grave throughout the proceedings. When the final witness stepped down, he addressed Garrison directly. Mr. Garrison, these are serious allegations. Do you wish to respond? Garrison, his face ashen, looked around the room at the townspeople who had once respected him. His shoulders slumped in defeat. I have nothing to say, Your Honor. Then I have no choice but to dismiss all charges against Miss Hayes, the judge declared. Furthermore, I am directing Sheriff Peters to begin an investigation into Mr. Garrison's business practices immediately. The gavel came down with finality, and the tension in the room broke. People surged forward, some to congratulate Olivia, others to demand explanations from Garrison. Matthew took Olivia's hand and led her through the crowd toward the exit. Outside, in the clear morning light, he turned to her with a smile that made her heart skip. It's over, he said. Your name is cleared. Tears of relief sprang to Olivia's eyes. I can hardly believe it. How can I ever thank you? Have dinner with me tonight, Matthew said, still holding her hand. Not as part of an investigation, just dinner. I'd like that, Olivia replied, suddenly shy. As word of Garrison's deception spread through Scottsbluff, the town's attitude toward Olivia transformed. Those who had whispered behind her back now approached with apologies. Parents who had questioned whether she should continue teaching now praised her resilience. Even Judge Wilson commended her courage in standing against a powerful man. But it was Matthew's steady support that meant the most. Over the weeks that followed, their dinners became a regular occurrence. Sometimes at her cottage, sometimes at his ranch, sometimes at the hotel restaurant where they no longer cared who saw them together. On a warm August evening, as they sat on the porch of his ranch house, watching the sunset paint the distant bluffs gold and crimson, Matthew took her hand. I've been thinking, he began, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant, about the future. Have you? Olivia asked, her pulse quickening. The school term starts again soon, he continued. You'll be busy with your students. I'll be occupied with the fall roundup. But I'd like to keep seeing you, Olivia. In fact, he turned to face her, his eyes reflecting the sunset glow. I can't imagine not seeing you. Matthew, let me finish, he said gently. What happened with Garrison was terrible, but I can't help feeling grateful that it brought us together. These past weeks have been the happiest of my life. Mine too, Olivia admitted softly. I know it's soon, Matthew said, taking both her hands in his. And I'm not asking for an answer right away, but I want you to know that I'm falling in love with you, Olivia Hayes. And when you're ready, if you ever feel the same, I'd like to court you properly, with an eye toward a future together. Olivia felt as though her heart might burst from her chest. The feelings that had been growing within her since that first day in Garrison's store, admiration, gratitude, friendship, had blossomed into something deeper, something she had scarcely dared acknowledge even to herself. Matthew, she said, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling within her, I don't need time to consider. I already know my heart. She squeezed his hands. I'm falling in love with you too. The smile that lit his face was like sunrise breaking over the plains. He leaned forward, hesitating just a breath away from her lips. May I? In answer, Olivia closed the distance between them, her lips meeting his in a kiss that felt like coming home. As summer gave way to autumn, their courtship became the talk of Scottsbluff, not in whispers of scandal, but in approving nods and knowing smiles. Olivia returned to teaching, her classroom fuller than ever as parents who had once doubted her now entrusted her with additional children. Matthew's small ranch prospered as he expanded his herd and hired 2 local boys as hands. Elias Garrison, facing multiple charges of fraud and embezzlement, sold his store to a younger merchant from Cheyenne and left town with his wife, who had chosen to stand by him despite everything. The new owner, a fair-minded man named Porter, made a point of inviting Olivia to shop there free of charge for a year, to make amends for my predecessor's behavior, he explained. In late September, Matthew rode into town with a special purpose. He visited the bank, then the jeweler, before calling at Olivia's cottage as she returned from school. Ride with me, he suggested, helping her onto his second horse, a gentle mare he'd been training. They rode out of town, following the North Platte River as it wound through the valley. The cottonwoods along the banks were turning golden, their leaves rustling in the breeze. When they reached a picturesque bend in the river, Matthew suggested they stop to rest the horses. As Olivia admired the view, Matthew took a small box from his pocket and dropped to one knee beside her. The simple gold ring inside caught the afternoon sunlight, gleaming against the dark velvet. Olivia Hayes, he said, his voice strong and sure. I've traveled from Texas to Montana, seen more of this country than most men ever will. But I never found a place that felt like home until I found you. Will you marry me? Tears of joy sprang to Olivia's eyes. Yes, she whispered, then louder. Yes, Matthew, I will marry you. As he slipped the ring onto her finger, Olivia thought of the journey that had brought them here, a false accusation, a fight for justice, and a love that had grown from the most unexpected beginnings. They were married on a crisp October morning, with half the town in attendance. Judge Wilson performed the ceremony in the schoolhouse, which the children had decorated with autumn leaves and wildflowers. Clara Wilson served as Olivia's matron of honor, and Sheriff Peters stood as Matthew's best man. Never seen a courtship quite like yours, the sheriff commented at the reception. Started with a bail payment and ended with wedding bells. That's Scottsbluff for you, never a dull moment. The newlyweds settled on Matthew's ranch, with Olivia continuing to teach. They converted an unused bunkhouse into a small library, filling it with books ordered from back east. On weekends, children from town rode out to borrow volumes, turning the ranch into an unofficial gathering place. The following spring brought the news that Elias Garrison had been convicted and sentenced to 3 years in prison. The same letter, carried by the twice-weekly stagecoach, also brought word that Olivia's application for additional school funding had been approved by the county. Justice comes in many forms, Matthew observed as they sat on their porch that evening watching the sunset. Olivia, her head resting against his shoulder, placed his hand on the gentle swell of her stomach. "And blessings too," she said softly. "Some unexpected." Matthew's face lit with wonder. "Are you certain? Dr. Wilson confirmed it yesterday," Olivia replied, smiling at her husband's expression. "We'll be parents by winter." He gathered her in his arms, his joy too great for words. As twilight settled over the Nebraska plains, Olivia thought of the twisted path that had led her here, a false accusation that might have destroyed her, transformed instead into the beginning of her greatest happiness. Their daughter, Emma Claire Zachary, was born on a snowy December night, with Clara Wilson attending and Matthew pacing anxiously until the newborn's cries filled the ranch house. With her mother's auburn hair and her father's determined chin, she became the center of their world. Life settled into a rhythm of seasons. Olivia taught during the school year and helped with the ranch in summer. Matthew's horse breeding business flourished, his animals developing a reputation throughout the territory. Their home became known for its hospitality, their Sunday dinners drawing friends from town and neighboring homesteads. 2 years after Emma's birth, their son George Matthew arrived, named for Olivia's father and his own. The pocket watch that had nearly destroyed Olivia's reputation was presented to Matthew on their 5th wedding anniversary, inscribed now with both their initials alongside the original dedication. "For the man who fought for my honor when few others would," Olivia told him as he opened the gift. "May our children inherit your courage and your kindness. And your resilience," Matthew added, kissing her tenderly. "The strength that helped you stand against injustice." As the years passed, Scottsbluff grew from a frontier settlement to a proper town. Olivia's small school expanded into a brick building with 3 classrooms and a bell tower. The Zachary Ranch prospered, eventually encompassing over 2,000 acres. Emma grew into a spirited young woman with her mother's love of learning and her father's easy way with horses. George, quieter but equally determined, showed an aptitude for business that promised to serve the ranch well in future years. 10 years to the day after Elias Garrison had publicly accused Olivia of theft, a letter arrived from St. Louis. Garrison, released from prison years earlier and now working as a clerk in his brother-in-law's business, had written to apologize. "I was a desperate man driven by my own weakness to destroy an innocent woman's reputation," he wrote. "Not a day passes that I don't regret the pain I caused you. I don't ask forgiveness, I don't deserve it, but I wanted you to know that your courage in standing against me changed me. I am trying, however imperfectly, to live honestly now." Olivia read the letter twice before handing it to Matthew. "What do you think?" she asked. "I think," Matthew said thoughtfully, "that redemption is possible for anyone, even Elias Garrison." Olivia nodded. Looking out over the land they'd built together, the ranch house expanded to accommodate their growing family, the stables full of fine horses, the small schoolhouse they'd built for neighboring children too far from town. "Should I write back?" she wondered. Matthew slipped his arm around her waist. "What does your heart tell you? That holding on to bitterness serves no purpose," Olivia decided. "And that without his terrible accusation we might never have found each other." "Then write to him," Matthew suggested, "not for his sake but for yours." The letter Olivia composed that evening was brief but sincere. She acknowledged Garrison's apology and assured him she harbored no ill will. "The path that began with your false accusation led me to true happiness," she concluded. "I hope you find the same in your new life." That night, as they prepared for bed, Olivia found Matthew standing by the window, looking out at the star-filled sky. "Penny for your thoughts," she said, coming to stand beside him. "I was just thinking about that day in the store," he replied, drawing her into his arms. "If I'd arrived 5 minutes later, or if I'd gone to the blacksmith's first as I'd planned." "But you didn't," Olivia reminded him, resting her head against his chest. "You were exactly where you needed to be, exactly when I needed you most." "Some might call that coincidence," Matthew said, his voice thoughtful. "I call it fate." "Fate," Olivia echoed, lifting her face for his kiss. "I like the sound of that." In the years that followed, the story of the merchant's false accusation and the cowboy who proved a schoolteacher's innocence became part of Scottsbluff's folklore. It was told at barn raisings and church socials, embellished with each telling until it took on the quality of legend. But for Matthew and Olivia Zachary, it remained simply the beginning of their story, a reminder that sometimes, from the darkest moments come the greatest blessings, and that justice, though it may be delayed, will ultimately prevail when good people stand together against falsehood. As their children grew and the 19th century gave way to the 20th, Olivia often thought of that long-ago July day. The pocket watch that had nearly ruined her became a cherished family heirloom, passed eventually to George and then to his son, each generation adding its own chapter to the story of a false accusation and the love that blossomed in its aftermath. And on quiet evenings, when Matthew and Olivia sat on their porch watching the sunset gild the Nebraska plains, they would sometimes speak of how a merchant's lie had led them to a lifetime of truth, and how what was meant to destroy had instead created something beautiful and enduring. "If I had to face it all again," Olivia would say, her hand in his, "I would, knowing you'd be there." "Always," Matthew would reply, the promise as true in their silver years as it had been on that first day when he'd stepped forward to defend a woman he barely knew, but somehow recognized as the other half of his soul. "Always."